TV School Time History, Burlington.
It's TV School Time. WOI-TV, in association with the State College of Iowa, presents another program in the Iowa TV School Time series, Landmarks in Iowa History. Today's topic is Burlington. Your teacher is Herb Hake of the State College of Iowa.
Hello, boys and girls. Have you ever wondered why I'm never run over by cars when I'm standing in the middle of the street here? You know, every week for a half an hour, I'm usually standing in the street. And sometimes we're in a very busy place, as we are today. We're in Burlington, and this is the downtown area. And yet there are no cars zipping by here. I don't have to dodge any cars, and our cameramen don't have to be in fear of their lives from passing motorists. Well, we always make arrangements ahead of time. When we're in a place like this, we go to the police department and we say, would it be possible to block off the street for a half an hour so we can do a television show? And they say, what kind of a show is this? And we say, well, it's an educational show. It's a program designed for use in the schoolroom, and we'd like to be able to do this without having cars going by all the time. And they say, all right, we'll do it. So we're on 3rd Street in Burlington today, between Washington and Columbia Streets. And the police department has put a blockade down there at the intersection of 3rd and Columbia, and over here at the intersection of 3rd and Washington. And for this half hour, there will be no cars going by. Isn't that nice of them to do that? They're very courteous, very cooperating. Now, I hope that some of the people who have their cars parked here don't decide in the middle of the show to back out and drive away. If they do, we're in trouble. So I hope our camera crew can keep people from coming in here and driving their cars out. You see this scar on the landscape here? This hole? Well, this is now a parking lot. The parking lot has become the graveyard of many of our historic landmarks. And this is an example. At one time, on this spot, there stood a building which was the first territorial legislature of Iowa. And the building was made of brick and stone and would have stood there for 100 years and longer, because it was very, very strongly made. But in 1881, somebody decided, well, that building's been there long enough, let's tear it down. And so it was torn down, and a theater was built there. And not so many years ago, they decided they didn't need the theater anymore, so they tore the theater down. And there's nothing there now. It's just used as a place for parking cars. And this has happened many, many places in Iowa. I've gone to see the place where Mark Twain lived, for example, in Muscatine. And I asked where the house was, and they said, oh, that was torn down a long time ago. We have a parking lot there now. So the parking lot is the place where many historic buildings have stood. And this is an example. All that is left is just a marker over here that says, on this spot stood Old Zion Church, which was the home of the first territorial legislature of Iowa. I think it's too bad that so many of our important historic buildings have been torn down in order to make room for parking lots. I'm not against parking lots, you understand, but it seems to me they could be put somewhere else. Well, let me show you the building that used to stand on this spot in Burlington. This was a building called Old Zion. And I made a drawing of it here. Now, as I look at this drawing, now that I have it completed, It seems to me that this steeple here is crooked. Does it look that way to you, boys and girls? I'm afraid it is. This is what happens sometimes when you make a drawing, especially a large drawing like this. You work fairly close to it, and you can't see exactly what is straight and what is perfectly vertical, what is perfectly horizontal. And I'm afraid I got this steeple crooked. It should be straight, of course. It was built straight, and I should have drawn it that way. I just am making this explanation so that you'll understand what happened. This steeple was not thrown off center by an earthquake. It was not an earthquake, it was Herb Hake. Well, if you can imagine that this steeple is straight, we'll go on from there, because the building was true when it was first built. This building was put up by a doctor named William Ross, who came to this area in 1833. And way back in those days, there was no city of Burlington. This was just a raw pioneer community. The first name given to this area was Shokokan, which is an Indian name meaning Flint Hills. There was a lot of flint around here, and the Indians used it for making arrowheads. And a man named Chief Tama, have you ever heard that name, Tama? There's a county in Iowa named Tama County, and there is a town in Iowa called Tama, but they're not anywhere near Burlington. But Chief Tama first settled in this area, in what is now Burlington, and he called the settlement Shokokan, meaning Flint Hills, hills of flint. Well, the Indians were living here, but the white settlers began to come into this area after the Black Hawk War. And one of the first settlers to come was William Ross, who was a doctor. Now, there wasn't much need for doctoring in a pioneer village, so he started a store, and he became the first storekeeper. And since he had the first store, he also had the post office in the store. Just one section of the store became the post office. So William Ross was also the first postmaster. And he was the first something else. He was the first man to get married in what became Burlington. He met a young lady, and they courted around for a while. And he said, after a while, "Will you marry me, ma'am?" And she said, "Yes, sir." See, they were very, very polite in those days. And then Dr. Ross said, "Well, now that we got that settled, where are we going to get married?" Because there was no church, and there was no preacher. So he wrote to a friend in Illinois, and they got a marriage license in Illinois, and they hired a preacher from Monmouth, Illinois, and William Ross and his bride-to-be crossed the river in a boat and were married in a field on the other side of the river in Illinois. So after they got back home, Dr. Ross said, "We can't have this kind of thing going on. We should have some place to get married, for people to get married. There may be others who will have this idea. Maybe other people will want to get married. They can't all go across the river. Maybe there wouldn't be a preacher there." So he decided to build a church. And he excavated this land that you see in the background here and got some brick from St. Louis and began building a church. This was to be a church. First of all, it was a church. And the church then became a kind of a community center. Only this part of it was first built, this part here, without the steeple. Just this part. And it was had one floor and a basement. Well, this became a church. It was used by other congregations besides the Methodist Church. It happened that Dr. Ross was a Methodist, but it was used for all kinds of purposes. It was a town hall, it was an assembly hall. And then, when the legislature decided to meet here, the building which they had first occupied had burned down, and Dr. Ross was running out of money to finish the building, and he thought, why couldn't I rent this to the legislature? So he talked to Governor Robert Lucas about it, and Governor Lucas said, sure, that's a good idea. So Dr. Ross was paid rent for the use of this building by the legislature, and that enabled him to finish the building. See, Dr. Ross was not a rich man. He believed with the old Yiddish philosopher that poverty is no disgrace, but it is no great honor either. So he was willing to get money from whatever source he could. So this building became important, not because it was a church, not because it was a kind of a town hall, but because it was occupied by the first territorial legislature of Iowa. Iowa became a legislature on July the 4th, 1838, and this building was ready for the legislature to occupy. So many of the laws which are still on our books were made in this building, and that's another reason why it should have been saved. It could have been saved. It was strongly built, but the people decided after the legislature moved to Iowa City that they didn't need this building anymore and they needed a bigger church anyhow, so they just tore it down, which is too bad. Incidentally, Dr. Ross came to what was then Flint Hills in 1833, and the following year a man named James Gray came to this area, and he was from Vermont. He was a long way from home, and he was a little homesick, and he remembered a town in Vermont named Burlington, Vermont. So he talked to the other settlers in the area and suggested that they call this new settlement Burlington. And from 1834 on, it was called Burlington. That's how the name Burlington came to be applied to this city. First it was Shokokan, then the English translated that into Flint Hills. Somebody suggested that Pin Hook would be a good name. I don't know where they got that idea. And somebody suggested Catfish Bend, because there were catfish in the river. But nobody cared about that. They didn't care to have Catfish Bend on their postmarks. So when this man suggested Burlington, they adopted Burlington as the name, and it has been Burlington ever since. Well, this building then was the home of the first territorial legislature. There are two houses in the legislature, as you know from your study of American history. There is the House of Representatives, which is called the lower house, and then there is the Senate, which is called the upper house. Well, the House of Representatives is usually larger than the Senate, so they had to have a larger room for the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives of the first legislature met here on the first floor, and the upper house, the Senate, met in the basement. So that was a kind of a reversal, wasn't it? The lower house met upstairs, and the upper house met in the basement. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about this whole matter of the territory. You see, the territory of Iowa was established in 1838. Before that, all of what is now Iowa was a part of the Wisconsin Territory. And before that, it was part of the Michigan Territory. Well, when Michigan was admitted to the Union as a state, the boundaries of Michigan were defined, and that left the rest of the area as territorial, and that became the Wisconsin Territory. The first capital of the Wisconsin Territory was Belmont, over here. See, that's on the east side of the river. All of this was the Wisconsin Territory. And this much of it here, you see, this little area here, later became Iowa. But at one time, this was all Wisconsin Territory, and the capital was here at Belmont. Well, Belmont was just a little crossroads town. The people in Wisconsin were planning to build a capital in Madison, but the capital hadn't been built yet. So for the time being, they were meeting in Belmont. Well, there was a member from this district here of the territory who said, Belmont isn't really a big enough place for a legislature. The members of the legislature have to have places to stay. They're far from home. They must have comfortable lodging. They must have places to eat. And when you get a lot of people together like this, a little town isn't big enough to handle all of them. So he said to the members of the legislature in Belmont, if you'll come to Burlington, where I live, I'll put up a building with my own money, and you can have the sessions of the legislature there. Burlington is becoming quite a town. There are a lot of places to stay, a lot of fine eating places, and I think you like it there. And so the other people said, well, I think the man's got a point. Belmont is too small. So in 1837, the legislature of the territory of Wisconsin met in Burlington. And Jeremiah Smith had built a frame structure, a two-story building that would be suitable for the legislature, and they met there one time. Then just before Christmas in 1837, somebody overheated the stove or some sparks lodged in the chimney or something, and the whole thing burned down. Building burned down. And that was when Dr. Ross, who was building this Methodist church at the time, had the idea of offering his building to the legislature as a meeting place. And Governor Lucas approved of this, rent was paid, and the legislature met in Old Zion Methodist Church 4 successive times, from 1838 to 1841. After 1841, the legislature moved to Iowa City, which had become the new capital of the territory. But the legislature met for 4 times in this church, Old Zion. By 1838, Iowa had been admitted to the Union as a territory, and this became the territory of Iowa, you see, this dark part here. And the capital of the territory remained at Burlington. This had been first the capital of the Wisconsin territory, you remember. Then it became the capital of the Iowa territory. Now you may ask, why would they locate the capital of a big strip of land like this way down here in the corner? Why wouldn't it be over here? Can you think of an answer to that? It was because most of the people lived down here. Most of the white settlers lived down here. This was the center of population. Then as the center of population moved further west and further toward the north, the capital of the territory was moved up here. And the capital became Iowa City. Later on, when Iowa became a state and the whole area became filled with people, the capital was moved more to the center, and it became Des Moines, which it still is. So you see, when we put the state on here, and Iowa became a state on December 28, 1846, this was the first state capital of Iowa, Iowa City. Then in 1857, the capital was moved to Des Moines. This was due to the fact that people kept moving further west, and they wanted to keep the capital at the center of population. So Burlington was the first territorial capital, because that was the center of population around there. Then Iowa City in 1842, and it became the first state capital in 1846. And then in 1857, the state capital moved over here to Des Moines. So that's the way things have developed as people have moved further toward the west. Now, getting back to the story of Old Zion, let me show you a few pictures here. I told you that there is nothing left of Old Zion except a marker. And this is the marker. There is a kind of a masonry structure here made of blocks of stone. And on top of it, there is a lintel. A lintel is the stone above the entrance. This stone here on the top was above the entrance to the church, the old church. And it had M.E. Church on it. This was used as a base for some bronze plaques on top. And the bronze plaques tell that this was the site of Old Zion Methodist Church. It wasn't always called Old Zion. It was just a Methodist church at first. Then, after the building had been standing there for a while, the roof began to wear out, And the editor of the Burlington paper said in a headline, "Old Zion needs a new roof." He just took it upon himself to call the Methodist Church Old Zion. Zion, you know, is a word that describes a place where people hope to go when they die, a place where everything is sweetness and light, a place where people always speak politely to each other, where there is love for neighbors, and where people live in peace and happiness. So the church, which by that time was considered to be an old building, was called Old Zion, and the name stuck. From that time on until the building was torn down in 1881, it was called Old Zion. Now I call your attention to this sign above this. I don't know why it had to be put right there, but that's where it is. The Elks have put this sign up, and it says, "Private parking. Violators will be towed away." I wish they had put that sign up before 1881. Violators will be towed away, because I think the people that tore that building down were violators. That was an important historic building. And I think the people who came to tear that building down should have been called violators, and they should have been towed away. They didn't have tow trucks in those days, but they could have been hauled off. They could have torn some other building down. But they put this sign up a little too late. Now it refers to people who try to get into that parking lot who are not members of the Elks Club. If they haven't got an Elks tooth, they'll be hauled out. The Methodist Church in Burlington now is one of the largest in the state. This is the First Methodist Church. It is called the daughter of Old Zion, because the people who left the old church came into this new building. And up here in the belfry is the bell from Old Zion, the original bell. Here's another picture of the church. You see what a big building it is, and the bell is up here. This is the First Methodist Church of Burlington. And here is the bell. I climbed up a whole series of rickety ladders to get up into the belfry to take this picture, because this bell originally hung in Old Zion. It was rung when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. It was rung with rejoicing when Lee surrendered at Appomattox and ended the Civil War. It was tolled when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And, of course, it was used to announce church services every Sunday, too. And it is still used by the First Methodist Church to announce church services. This has been a great favorite with the pigeons for over 100 years, as you can see. Here's another landmark in Burlington. This is in Crapo Park overlooking the Mississippi River. This is Black Hawk Spring. And the story is that Black Hawk used to stop here and quench his thirst. Quite a large spring here. It flows out of a cave. You can see how big it is compared to these people standing around it. But there's a cemetery up here now, and the drainage makes this water unsuitable for drinking purposes. There is the Silas Hudson House in Burlington, and the story goes that Abraham Lincoln slept here in 1858 when he was touring the country as a young lawyer, speaking in opposition to Stephen A. Douglas. And one time he was invited to Burlington to give a speech. Nobody thought he'd ever be president, of course. He was running for the Senate then. And he was invited to stay here overnight. You've heard of places where George Washington slept. They have signs in front saying George Washington slept here. Well, they could put a sign in front of this house saying Abraham Lincoln slept here. Also in Crapo Park there is this impressive statue. I wouldn't have to tell you that. This is a statue, of course. Or we might even say, of course, this is a statue. And we'd be right both times, because this is a statue of General John M. Corse. So, of course, it is a statue. Right? Right. Well, if you want to read the story of Old Zion, I suggest you try to get a copy of the Iowan magazine for December-January 1958-59. It's the one that has this picture of the three kings on the cover. See, this is the Christmas issue. So there are the three kings of Orient. But inside, there is a story of Old Zion. Old Zion, Iowa's first capital. Now you see the steeple is straight there, as it was when it was built. If you want a copy of this magazine, write to the Iowan Magazine, Shenandoah, Iowa, and send $1.50. This is a thick magazine, has a lot of pictures in it, costs $1.50. Don't expect to get it free. Now let's review for a minute. And I want to call your attention again to the fact that this building, Old Zion, which has been our main subject today, Old Zion was built by Dr. William Ross, who was one of the pioneers of Burlington. And you remember when Dr. Ross came to Burlington, this was called Flint Hills, because the hills of Burlington were filled with flint for the making of arrowheads. So we'll draw a flint arrowhead here to remind us of the original Burlington. Now let's see, we should make a picture of Dr. Ross out of this now. There his eyes. In those days they wore beards. And here are his ears. Now you'd think that I'm giving Dr. Ross a pointed head, wouldn't you? I'm not through with the drawing yet. I have to be patient when I'm drawing pictures. Put a little hair in here like this. And then we'll turn it over to get a picture of Dr. Ross. And this is Dr. Ross. You thought that was his beard, didn't you? No, that's his hair. He wore his hair combed up like that. And he had a little pointed beard. This is Dr. Ross, the man who built Old Zion, and who spent so much money on it that he didn't have very much to pass on to his children. He was a dedicated man. And I think all of us ought to remember him with a great deal of gratitude. One of the things about this story of Old Zion, which I hope you haven't missed, is that this was an early example of the church and state getting together. There is a feeling sometimes that the church and the state should be separated. But there have been many examples in the past of the church and the state getting along very well together. And this is one example. We'll say this is the state. And here is the church. Now you think they're both glowering at each other there, wouldn't you? But they're not. Because in Burlington, as you remember, the state rented the church for the legislature. And look how they got along. See there? They're both smiling at each other. So it is possible for the church and state to work in harmony, as I'm sure you will recognize when you remember the story of Old Zion. Next week, we are going to Plum Grove, the home of the first territorial governor of Iowa. Until then, goodbye.
Today, your teacher has been Herb Hake of the State College of Iowa. Landmarks in Iowa History is produced for Iowa TV School Time by WOI-TV in association with the State College of Iowa. TV School Time is presented daily, Monday through Friday, at 10:30 a.m. by the Iowa Joint Committee on Educational Television.